Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug you've probably been offered in a bathroom, maybe at a club, maybe at a festival, maybe at an after party that went longer than anyone planned. Someone pulled out a little bag of white powder, called it K or Special K or Ket, and asked if you wanted a bump. Maybe you said yes, maybe you said no, maybe you're still deciding. Either way, you probably have questions. What actually is this stuff? Why does it make people go wobbly and stare at walls? What's a K-hole and should you be afraid of it? And why are doctors suddenly charging $800 to give this same party drug to depressed people in clinical settings? Tonight, we're answering all of it. Because ketamine has one of the strangest origin stories in drug history, and understanding where it came from might change how you think about where it's going. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these slow, absurd tales. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with what actually happens when you take it. Because if you've never done ketamine, the descriptions probably sound like nonsense. And if you have done it, you know how hard it is to explain to someone who hasn't. A small bump and you feel floaty, loose, like someone turned down the gravity in your body by about 30%. The music sounds different. Not louder, just more there. Like each note has texture you can almost touch. Your body feels like it belongs to someone else. Someone you're friendly with but don't fully control. Walking becomes an adventure in geometry. Stairs become a philosophical problem. Conversations become fascinating, even when they're about nothing in particular. Everything feels slightly hilarious and profoundly okay, in a way that's hard to justify but impossible to argue with. People call it wonky. That's the technical term, apparently. You go wonky, your legs go wonky. Reality goes a bit wonky. It's not the precise vocabulary of pharmaceutical science, but it's accurate. A bigger dose and things get weirder. The room starts to stretch in directions that rooms shouldn't stretch. Time stops behaving like time. 5 minutes might feel like an hour, or an hour might vanish in what feels like seconds. Your thoughts loop in on themselves like a snake eating its tail. You might find yourself unable to move, not because you're paralyzed, but because movement seems like a concept from another dimension, something that applies to other people in other circumstances. You're still conscious, technically, but you has become a flexible term open to interpretation. The term people use is dissociation. You dissociate from your body, you dissociate from your normal sense of self, you become an observer of your own existence rather than a participant in it. Which sounds terrifying when you write it down, but in practice can feel like the most peaceful thing you've ever experienced. Or the most terrifying. Ketamine doesn't really do middle ground. And then there's the K-hole. The place you go when you take enough to fully disconnect from consensus reality. People describe it as leaving their body entirely, not metaphorically, literally feeling like consciousness has relocated to somewhere outside physical form, floating through void spaces that have no relationship to the room you're actually lying in, encountering entities that may or may not be projections of your own mind. Experiencing what feels like death and rebirth, complete with the tunnel and the light and the life review, except you wake up on your friend's couch instead of in the afterlife. Some people find this terrifying, being trapped in a body that won't respond while your sense of self dissolves into cosmic static is not everyone's idea of a good Friday night. Some people have one K-hole experience and never touch ketamine again, grateful to have their boring, ordinary consciousness back. Others chase it deliberately. They're not interested in the wonky party dose. They want the full departure, the complete disconnection, the journey to wherever ketamine takes you when you take enough. For them, the K-hole isn't a side effect to avoid. It's the destination. Same drug, same dose sometimes, completely different experiences depending on factors nobody fully understands. Your brain chemistry, your expectations, the setting, what you ate, how much water you drank, whether Mercury is in retrograde, nobody knows. Ketamine just does what it does and you find out which version you get. To understand how this drug ended up being passed around at parties, we need to go back to a time when the biggest problem in medicine was figuring out how to cut someone open without accidentally killing them in the process. Because surgery, for most of human history, was basically torture with medical degrees. Before anesthesia, your options were grim. Bite down on this leather strap. Drink this whiskey until you can't feel your face. Have 4 strong men hold you down while the surgeon works fast and hopes you don't die from shock. Speed was everything. The best surgeons were the fastest surgeons, not because of skill, but because every extra second was another second of screaming. The world record for leg amputation was about 30 seconds, which sounds impressive until you realise someone was timing this, and the reason was, our patient is awake and would very much like to stop screaming now. For the next century, medicine kept trying and kept finding exciting new ways to accidentally kill people. Ether worked great until it turned operating rooms into surprise crematoriums. One stray spark and suddenly your appendectomy becomes a Viking funeral. Chloroform was more elegant, right up until it stopped hearts like a board, God hitting the off switch. The gap between pleasantly unconscious and permanently deceased was so narrow you could trip over it. Then came various gases that worked beautifully, unless you needed your patient to do something inconvenient, like breathe. Every solution came with a fun new way to kill someone. Medical conferences must have been depressing. Good news, we figured out how to knock people out. Bad news, roughly 1 in 50 doesn't wake up. Anyway, who wants lunch? By the 1950s, pharmaceutical companies were still hunting for the Holy Grail, something safe, simple, and forgiving enough that you wouldn't accidentally turn a routine surgery into a homicide investigation. In 1962, a chemist named Calvin Stevens at Park Davis finally cracked it. Well, almost. See, Park Davis had already tried something called phencyclidine. You might know it as PCP. It worked beautifully on paper. Patients dissociated, felt nothing. Breathing stable, blood pressure steady. Perfect. Except when they woke up, they kept reporting they'd met God. And not the friendly, welcome to heaven God. The Old Testament God. The one with opinions and a temper. 1 minute you're getting your gallbladder removed, the next you're convinced you've been appointed Earth's ambassador to a hostile alien federation, and you have urgent news for the nursing staff. The drug worked on the body and occasionally put the mind through a garbage disposal. Surgeons loved it. Psychiatrists, less so. Stevens was basically handed a recipe for a cake that occasionally summoned demons and told to make it family-friendly. His assignment? Keep the good parts of PCP, the dissociation, the stable breathing, the patient doesn't scream during surgery thing, while eliminating the part where patients woke up convinced they'd been personally briefed by Satan about humanity's upcoming performance review. He tinkered with the molecular structure for months, tweaking atoms like a DJ remixing a track that occasionally made people violent. A little change here, a little change there, testing each version on animals who presumably had opinions about being sent to alternate dimensions but couldn't file complaints. In 1962, he synthesized something new. Same dissociation, fewer demons. Test subjects woke up feeling weird but not cosmically traumatized. Nobody tried to fight the nurses. Nobody claimed to have received transmissions from beyond. Progress. They called it ketamine. catchy name, much better than PCP but less satanic, which was technically more accurate but harder to fit on a prescription pad. The FDA approved it in 1970. Ketamine became standard in emergency rooms, pediatric surgery, veterinary medicine, where it earned the horse tranquilizer reputation it would never quite shake. Yes, it knocks out horses, also children, also soldiers, car crash victims, and anyone else who needs to not feel pain for a while. Nobody calls it child tranquilizer, because that's harder to joke. About at parties, it landed on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, right up there with antibiotics and vaccines. Ketamine had made it a legitimate pharmaceutical success story, a molecule that did exactly what it was supposed to do, for about 5 minutes. The thing about consciousness-altering drugs is that someone always wants to try them recreationally. It's basically a law of nature, like gravity or the tendency for toast to land butter side down. If a substance changes how the brain works, some curious human will eventually take it outside medical supervision just to see what happens. Scientists call this off-label use. Everyone else calls it Tuesday. With ketamine, the curious humans were scientists first, which is either reassuring or terrifying depending on your opinion of scientists. John Lilly was a neuroscientist already famous for trying to communicate with dolphins while on various substances, which tells you everything you need to know about what counted as research methodology in the 1970s. The man had a government grant to get high and talk to marine mammals. Different era. He discovered that sub-anesthetic doses of ketamine, not enough to knock you out, just enough to make reality feel like a suggestion, produced experiences he described as journeys to other dimensions. He would float in isolation tanks for hours, dissociated on ketamine, exploring what he called alternate realities, and taking notes like a tourist in the afterlife. His lab notebooks read less like science and more like a travel blog for places that don't exist. His trip reports were something else, encounters with entities, messages from higher intelligences, the distinct impression that the universe was trying to tell him something important. Was he mapping uncharted territories of consciousness? Or was he just extremely high in a bathtub, writing down whatever his scrambled neuron suggested? The line between mystical insight and drug-induced rambling has always been blurry. Lilly spent years dancing back and forth across it, completely convinced he was doing important work. His colleagues were less sure. The dolphins had no comment, but word got out. It always does. The psychedelic underground of the 1970s was always looking for new tools, and here was something that produced profound alterations in consciousness, with a short duration, and a safety profile that made overdose almost impossible. You couldn't really die from ketamine alone. Your breathing wouldn't stop. Your heart would keep beating. You'd just go somewhere strange for a while and come back with stories that made no sense to anyone who wasn't there. It was like a round-trip ticket to another dimension with a guaranteed return flight. The universe's safest weird vacation. By the 1980s, ketamine had fully escaped the laboratory, and it found a natural home in the emerging rave culture, like a key finding a lock it didn't know existed. Everything about ketamine fit the club scene like it had been designed by a committee of DJs, drug enthusiasts, and people who really liked dancing but hated feeling self-conscious about it. Which, again, it hadn't been. It was designed for surgery. The party applications were a complete accident, like discovering that your surgical tools make excellent percussion instruments. The high was short, an hour or two, depending on dose, compared to LSD's 12-hour marathon that could turn a Saturday night into a Monday problem. You could take ketamine at midnight and be mostly functional by morning. This mattered if you had work Monday, which most people did because landlords don't accept "I was exploring alternate dimensions" as rent payment. Try explaining to your boss that you're late because you spent 6 hours as a disembodied consciousness floating through the void. HR doesn't have a form for that. The effects matched electronic music like peanut butter matches jelly. If peanut butter made you feel like you were dissolving into the bass, music became physical, something you moved through rather than just heard. Lights left trails like friendly ghosts following you around the dance floor. The boundary between self and sound got blurry, then disappeared entirely. Dancing felt less like moving your body and more like being moved by something larger. The music, the crowd, the universe, whatever you wanted to call it. The normal self-consciousness that made some people hate dancing just evaporated. Who cared how you looked? You was a flexible concept at the moment. Looking was debatable. Dancing was happening whether you planned it or not. And unlike alcohol, ketamine didn't make people aggressive. Nobody started fights on K. The drug made violence seem absurd, like a concept from a language you didn't speak and couldn't imagine learning. Clubs that turned into war zones on booze became gentle and curious on ketamine. Strangers talked to strangers with genuine interest, like everyone had suddenly realised that other people were actually fascinating and worth knowing. The paranoia that sometimes plagued other psychedelics was absent, replaced by a kind of cosmic everything is fine that made social anxiety seem like a problem from another lifetime, possibly someone else's lifetime, possibly a lifetime that had never existed at all. The powder could be snorted, convenient for club bathrooms where needles would raise concerns and pills took too long to kick in. Small bumps for the wonky, floaty feeling that made dancing feel like swimming through warm honey. Bigger doses for the K-hole, though most people saved that for after parties. You wanted to be able to dance after all, not lie on the floor contemplating the fundamental nature of existence while people stepped over you on their way to the bar. It went by different names. Special K, like the cereal, which probably made someone at Kellogg's marketing department very uncomfortable. Vitamin K, as if it were a nutritional supplement your doctor forgot to mention. Kit Kat, Cat Valium, Jet. The nicknames were affectionate, almost cute, the kind of names you give something you're genuinely fond of. You don't give cute nicknames to drugs that terrify you. You give cute nicknames to drugs that feel like friends. The UK rave scene adopted ketamine enthusiastically, like it had been waiting for exactly this drug its entire existence. Hong Kong developed what authorities called an epidemic, with teenage use rates that alarmed everyone who looked at the numbers. American clubs circulated it through networks that operated entirely on trust and knowing the right people, the same way anything good or illegal has always spread. By the 1990s, ketamine had two completely separate careers running simultaneously, like Clark Kent if Clark Kent was also moonlighting as a completely different kind of superhero. By day, a respectable anaesthetic saving lives in hospitals and veterinary clinics worldwide, still on the WHO's essential medicines list, still doing exactly what it was designed to do. By night, a club drug sending ravers on cosmic journeys in warehouse parties across multiple continents, doing something it was absolutely not designed to do, but turned out to be surprisingly good at. Same molecule, same chemistry, same atoms arranged in the same configuration, completely different contexts, completely different meanings, completely different legal statuses depending on who was holding it and why. The medical establishment eventually noticed that their surgical tool had developed a nightlife. This tends to make pharmaceutical companies nervous, not because they care about ravers, but because it creates liability questions and awkward conversations with regulators and the potential for congressional hearings where someone has to explain why a legitimate medication ended up in nightclub bathrooms. Yes, Senator, it's supposed to be for surgery. No, Senator, We don't know why it's at Burning Man. In 1999, the DEA placed ketamine on Schedule 3. Still legal for medical use, now illegal for recreation. The same drug that was saving lives in operating rooms could now get you arrested in a parking lot. The chemistry didn't change, the legal status did. Welcome to drug policy, where the rules have nothing to do with pharmacology and everything to do with who's using, where they're using, and how nervous it makes people in suits. But making something illegal has never stopped people from wanting it. If anything, it just changed who was selling and how much they were charging. The party continued. The K-holes kept happening. The bumps kept getting passed around in bathrooms from London to Los Angeles to Hong Kong. Ketamine had found its people, and its people had no intention of giving it up just because some politicians in suits decided it was dangerous. And here's the thing about ketamine that nobody at those parties understood yet. It actually was dangerous. Not in the way the DEA meant, not dangerous like heroin or meth. Not the kind of dangerous that kills you quickly and obviously. Ketamine was dangerous slowly, quietly, in ways that wouldn't show up for years. Because while ravers were chasing K-holes and club kids were going wonky on dance floors, something was happening inside their bodies that nobody was paying attention to. Something that would eventually turn this fun, floaty, harmless party drug into a medical nightmare. The destruction was already starting. Most people just couldn't feel it yet. Here's what nobody mentioned at the party. Here's what the guy with the baggie in the bathroom didn't bring up. Here's the part that got left out when people described ketamine as harmless or safe, or not like the hard drugs. Ketamine eats bladders. Not metaphorically. Not causes some mild discomfort. Literally destroys them from the inside out like acid dissolving tissue one bump at a time. And for years nobody connected the dots because who thinks about their bladder at a rave? You're too busy dissolving into the base and becoming one with the universe to notice that your urinary system is slowly staging a revolt. It starts small. You notice you're peeing more often, then more often than that. Then you're getting up 4 times a night, then 10 times. Then you're peeing every 15 minutes around the clock and it burns every single time like you're passing shattered glass through a straw. Your bladder, an organ that's supposed to hold about 400 to 500 millilitres of liquid, roughly the size of a grapefruit, starts shrinking. The walls thicken with scar tissue like the world's worst home renovation project. The capacity drops, 300 millilitres, 200, 100. In the worst cases, bladders shrink to the size of a shot glass, 50 millilitres. That's not enough to hold a decent gulp of water. Imagine having to pee 50 times a day, in agony every single time, because your bladder is now the size of something you do tequila from. The cosmic irony is almost too perfect. You took a drug to feel like you were leaving your body, and now your body is leaving you, one organ at a time. Doctors call it ketamine cystitis, or ketamine bladder syndrome, which makes it sound almost clinical and manageable, like something you'd treat with a cream and a pamphlet. It's not. It's brutal. It's life-destroying. And for a lot of people, it's permanent. The damage doesn't stop at the bladder, because why would it? The kidneys start backing up because urine can't drain properly. Hydronephrosis, swollen kidneys, failing organs, the kind of damage that used to only happen to elderly patients with decades of health problems behind them. Except now it was happening to teenagers, kids who started using at 15 and needed bladder reconstruction at 20. Young people who should have been worrying about exams and first apartments, and whether that person from the party was going to text back, instead learning medical terminology for organs they were losing. Some needed their bladders surgically reconstructed using tissue from their intestines. Some needed their bladders removed entirely. At ages when they weren't old enough to rent a car, they were getting fitted for urostomy bags. The party drug had eaten them from the inside, and it hadn't even had the decency to warn them first. Hong Kong found out before anyone else. They became the canary in the ketamine coal mine, except the canary was an entire generation of teenagers and the coal mine was their own urinary tracts. In the early 2000s, while Western doctors were still thinking of ketamine as that weird anesthetic that occasionally made patients feel floaty, teenagers in Hong Kong were snorting it like it was going out of style, which it wasn't. It was very much coming into style, the hottest trend in chemical escapism, available at prices that made alcohol look like a luxury item. The economics were hard to argue with if you didn't think about consequences. A gram of ketamine cost less than a night of drinking. You could get high for the price of a fancy coffee. You could order it delivered like pizza, and apparently the customer service was excellent, which is the kind of detail that makes you question what exactly we're doing as a civilization. 5-star reviews for your drug dealer. The future is weird. By 2005, ketamine had become the most commonly abused drug among Hong Kong teenagers. Not the second most common, not one of the top drugs, the most common, more popular than heroin, which is saying something in a region with a long and complicated heroin history. More popular than meth, more popular than ecstasy. In a city where parents worked punishing hours and teenagers were often left to figure out adolescence on their own, ketamine offered cheap escape, instant dissociation from a high-pressure life, a K-hole you could fall into when reality felt like too much. The numbers were genuinely staggering. In 1999, ketamine users represented about 1% of young drug users in Hong Kong. By 2006, that number had jumped to 73%. That's not a typo. 73%. Nearly 3 out of 4 young people who use drugs were using ketamine. The average age of first use kept dropping. 18, then 16, then younger. Some kids were starting at 10 or 11, getting the drug free from older kids who hung around playgrounds and school gates like some dystopian ice cream truck driver. As a girl, you don't need to pay for them, one teenage user explained to researchers. The boys just share them with you. Which sounds almost sweet until you remember what they were sharing and what it was doing to their organs. Free drugs with a side of bladder destruction. Romance in the 21st century. Then the bladder started failing, and failing, and failing. Doctors in Hong Kong began seeing something they'd never encountered before. Young people, some still in their teens, presenting with the urinary symptoms of elderly patients with advanced disease. Kids who should have been healthy were peeing blood. Teenagers were getting scopes shoved up their urethras so doctors could see what the hell was going on in there. The medical literature filled with case reports that read like horror stories. A 19-year-old needing surgery, a 22-year-old with kidney failure, kids who'd been using for 2 or 3 years already facing a lifetime of medical complications. By 2008, researchers had documented 59 cases in just 2 hospitals. By 2015, one study tracked 463 patients. Hong Kong urologists became the world's leading experts on ketamine bladder syndrome, the kind of medical expertise nobody wants to develop, in a specialty that shouldn't need to exist. These doctors went to medical school to help people. Now they were spending their careers trying to reconstruct the bladders of 20-year-olds who'd partied too hard at 16. The cruelest part, stopping didn't fully reverse the damage. Symptoms improved with abstinence, sure, but many patients were left with permanent impairment. The scarring remained. The bladders didn't bounce back. You could quit ketamine entirely, stay sober for years, live a completely different life, and still pee 30 times a day because your bladder remembers what you did to it. The party was over, but the bill would keep coming for the rest of your life. The UK learned the same lesson, just a few years behind. They watched Hong Kong happen and apparently thought, that won't happen here. It happened there. British clubbers had been using ketamine since the 1990s, but it escalated dramatically in the 2000s and 2010s. The UK became the ketamine capital of Europe. quite an achievement for a country that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be European or not. By the time Brexit happened, British teenagers had already been seceding from their own bladders for years. What made Britain distinctive wasn't just the scale, it was who was using. This wasn't just hardened club kids taking bumps on the dance floor at 3 a.m. It was university students at house parties, teenagers in provincial towns who'd never been to a rave in their lives, buying grams from friends of friends because it was cheaper than a night at the pub. Middle-class kids from nice families, treating ketamine less like a club drug and more like aggressive binge drinking. A way to get absolutely obliterated on a Friday night without the expense of a bar tab. The logic, if you could call it that, was almost reasonable. Alcohol costs money. Alcohol makes you sick the next day. Alcohol gives you a hangover that feels like your brain is trying to escape your skull. Ketamine was cheaper, didn't make you vomit, usually, and the come down was gentler. By the cold economics of getting wasted, it almost made sense. Except for the part where it destroyed your bladder. That part didn't make it into the cost-benefit analysis. The health consequences followed Hong Kong's pattern, just a few years behind. British urologists started seeing cases of ketamine cystitis. The numbers grew. UK hospitals established treatment protocols, essentially importing medical knowledge from Hong Kong, a strange reversal for a former colonial power. "We didn't know this was coming," one British doctor admitted. "Hong Kong tried to warn us. We didn't listen fast enough." The stories were harrowing. Young women who couldn't have sex because their bladders were too damaged. Young men who had to plan their entire lives around bathroom access. People in their early 20s carrying around spare clothes because accidents happened, and accidents were now just part of their lives. The indignity of it was almost as bad as the physical pain. Having to explain to dates, to employers, to friends why you needed to pee constantly, why you sometimes didn't make it in time, why your body had betrayed you at an age when it should have been at its strongest. Britain made ketamine a Class B controlled substance in 2014, which meant possession could get you 5 years in prison. The reclassification was supposed to reduce use. There's little evidence it worked. Ketamine use continued rising, even as legal consequences increased. The only thing that definitively changed was that now people with destroyed bladders also had criminal records. Progress. And then there was addiction. Because it turns out that when you give people a drug that makes them feel like they've escaped reality, like they've left behind all their problems and their anxieties and their mundane, disappointing lives, some of them don't want to come back. Ketamine addiction doesn't look like heroin addiction. There's no physical withdrawal that makes you sick, no shaking and sweating and vomiting. It's sneakier than that. It's the addiction of escape, of preferring the K-hole to the real world, of finding that dissociation is easier than dealing with your actual life. People started organising their entire existence around ketamine, using daily, then multiple times daily, waking up and doing a bump before getting out of bed because why face the morning sober? Carrying a bag everywhere, doing lines in bathroom stalls at work, at family dinners, at funerals. The dissociation that once felt like a special treat became the baseline. Being present in your own body started to feel foreign, uncomfortable, wrong. Some users described it as feeling more real while dissociated than they did sober, which is either a profound comment on the nature of consciousness or a really concerning sign of how badly ketamine rewires your sense of self. Probably the second one. Definitely the second one. The psychological damage accumulated alongside the physical. Memory problems, difficulty concentrating, that foggy, disconnected feeling that used to only happen while high started bleeding into sober hours. Some heavy users reported feeling permanently dissociated, never quite present, never quite connected to their own lives, like they'd taken so many trips to that other dimension that they'd left part of themselves there. And here's the thing about addiction. It doesn't care about your bladder. People kept using even when it hurt to pee, kept using even after their first surgery, kept using even when doctors told them explicitly that continuing would destroy what was left of their urinary system. The pull of that escape was stronger than the very real pain in their bodies. That's addiction. It doesn't make sense because it doesn't have to make sense. The drug doesn't negotiate. Matthew Perry had everything. Fame, money, access to the best healthcare in the world. He'd been open about his struggles, honest about his addictions in a way that most celebrities avoided. His memoir detailed decades of substance abuse, painkillers, alcohol, the terrifying moment when his colon burst from opioid overuse, the 14 trips to rehab. He'd been sober for 19 months. He was doing ketamine therapy for depression and anxiety, legally, with doctors under supervision. It still wasn't enough. Perry wanted more ketamine than his legitimate providers would give him. So he found people who would. A network of enablers assembled around him like some dark constellation. People who saw a chance to profit from a famous man's weakness and took it without much apparent hesitation. There was a doctor who allegedly texted a colleague, wondering how much this moron will pay. A woman known as the Ketamine Queen, who ran a supply operation out of North Hollywood, selling pharmaceutical-grade dissociatives to anyone with cash. Perry's own assistant, who had no medical training whatsoever, but learned to inject him at the actor's request because that's what he asked for, and saying no wasn't really in the job description. On October 28, 2023, the assistant injected Perry with ketamine at 8:30 a.m, then again at 12:45 p.m, then again about 40 minutes later, a shot Perry called a big one. He asked for it. He got it. He went to his hot tub to relax. When the assistant returned from running errands, he found Perry face down in the water. The autopsy found ketamine levels consistent with general anesthesia, the amount you'd use to knock someone out for surgery. His last legitimate ketamine treatment had been 10 days earlier. The drug that killed him came from the shadow network that had grown up around ketamine's weird dual identity. Medical miracle and party drug, and now, apparently, something you could get delivered to your Hollywood home if you knew the right people and had enough money. The Ketamine Queen had been connected to another overdose death years earlier. She'd Googled, can ketamine be listed as a cause of death after that one? She kept selling anyway. The market doesn't stop for casualties. There's always another customer, always another person who wants to escape so badly they'll take the risk. 5 people were eventually charged. The legal system would assign blame, hand down sentences, generate headlines for a day or two. But Perry's death exposed something uncomfortable. The line between patient receiving treatment and addict obtaining drugs had blurred to the point of invisibility. The system designed to help him hadn't been able to tell the difference. Maybe there wasn't one. So here's where we were by the 2020s. Ketamine had lived several different lives. Surgical tool, battlefield anesthetic, party drug, rave essential. And in its party drug phase, it had left a trail of destruction that stretched from Hong Kong to London to Hollywood, destroyed bladders, ruined kidneys, young people in their 20s facing medical problems that should have been reserved for their grandparents, addiction that didn't look like addiction until you were too deep to climb out. A beloved actor dead in his hot tub at 54. The party drug had partied hard, and the bill was coming due. If this were a morality tale, this would be the end. The moral would be clear. Drugs are bad. Ketamine destroyed lives. Don't do drugs. Stay in school, etc. Roll credits. But that's not what happened. Because while all this destruction was unfolding, while urologists were reconstructing bladders and addiction counsellors were trying to reach dissociated teenagers, and Matthew Perry was spiraling toward a hot tub in Los Angeles. Something else was happening in research labs that would complicate this story beyond recognition. Scientists were discovering that this same drug, this bladder-destroying, life-ruining party substance, might be the most important breakthrough in psychiatric medicine in 50 years. The drug that was destroying thousands of lives was also somehow saving them. Same molecule, same chemistry, same atoms arranged in the same configuration. How is that possible? How can something be poison and cure at the same time? How can a drug that ruined so many people be the thing that pulls others back from the edge? That's the next part of the story. The year was 2000. The place was Yale University. The researcher was John Crystal, and he was not trying to cure depression. This is important. Nobody set out to discover that ketamine fixes broken brains. Nobody had a hypothesis that said, you know what might help people who want to die? The horse tranquilizer that's destroying bladders in Hong Kong? That would be insane. That would be the kind of idea that gets you laughed out of grant committees and quietly removed from research positions. Crystal was studying schizophrenia. He was using ketamine as a tool, a way to temporarily scramble brain chemistry so he could observe what happened when certain pathways got disrupted. It's a legitimate research technique. You give someone a drug that mimics certain aspects of a condition, you watch what happens, you learn something about the condition. Science. The ketamine was supposed to be the means, not the end. It was the wrench, not the car. Nobody cared what ketamine did on its own. They cared about what it revealed about schizophrenia. But some of the patients in adjacent studies, people being treated for depression, not schizophrenia, started saying something strange. Something that made Crystal stop what he was doing and pay attention. After receiving ketamine, their depression lifted. Not, they felt a little better. Not their symptoms improved marginally over the following weeks. Lifted. Gone. Like someone had reached into their skulls and flipped a switch that had been stuck in the wrong position for years. And it happened fast. Not gradually the way antidepressants were supposed to work. Not with the slow accumulation of slightly better days that psychiatric medication usually offered. Within hours, sometimes within minutes. People who had been suicidal in the morning were making dinner plans by evening. People who hadn't felt hope in years suddenly felt it flooding back like someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed for decades. Crystal's reaction, and I'm paraphrasing here, was essentially, what the hell? To understand why this was so shocking, you need to understand what depression treatment looked like in 2000, and honestly, what it still looks like for most people today. The standard model goes like this. You're depressed. You go to a doctor. The doctor prescribes an antidepressant, probably an SSRI like Prozac or Zoloft or one of their chemical cousins. You take the pill every day, you wait, and wait, and wait. The standard timeline is 4 to 6 weeks before you feel any significant effect. A month and a half of continuing to feel terrible while you hope the medication is doing something you can't perceive yet. 6 weeks of waking up every morning still depressed, still struggling, still wondering if life is worth living, while you trust that tiny pills are slowly, invisibly adjusting your brain chemistry. For many people, that's an eternity. When you're genuinely depressed, not feeling sad, but clinically, profoundly depressed, 6 weeks can feel like 6 years. Every day is a battle just to exist. Every morning is a negotiation with yourself about whether to get out of bed. And the treatment requires you to keep fighting that battle, keep losing that negotiation for 6 more weeks while you wait to see if maybe this particular chemical will be the one that helps. And here's the really cruel part. It might not work. SSRIs don't work for everyone. The first medication you try has maybe a 40 to 50% chance of helping significantly. If it doesn't work, you try another one. More weeks of waiting, Another 4 to 6 weeks to see if this one does anything. If that doesn't work, you try another. More waiting, more suffering, more time. Some people cycle through medication after medication, year after year, never finding something that reliably helps. They become what psychiatrists call treatment resistant, a clinical term that essentially means we've tried everything and nothing works well enough. It's a diagnosis that sounds like giving up because in some ways it is. We've run out of easy options. We don't know what else to do. Sorry. For these people, the treatment-resistant cases, the ones who've tried 5 or 10 or 15 different medications without success, depression isn't a temporary condition. It's a life sentence. They wake up every day knowing that they'll probably feel this way forever, that medicine has essentially shrugged its shoulders at them, that the best they can hope for is managing symptoms rather than actually getting better. This is what psychiatry looked like in 2000. This is what it still looks like in many ways. Slow treatments that might not work, applied to people who are suffering unbearably, with no way to speed things up. And then ketamine walked into the room and broke every rule. The early observations at Yale were informal, just doctors noticing that something weird was happening with some of their patients. But weird observations in medicine either get ignored or they get studied, and Crystal wasn't the type to ignore things. In 2000, he and his colleague Dennis Charney published a small study. They gave ketamine to patients with treatment-resistant depression, people for whom nothing else had worked, and measured what happened. The results were, scientifically speaking, bananas. Within hours of a single ketamine infusion, patients reported significant improvement in their depression symptoms. Not all of them, but a striking majority. People who had been suffering for years, who had tried everything, who had essentially given up hope, were suddenly feeling better. Not just less terrible, actually better. Some described it as feeling like themselves again for the first time in years, like waking up from a nightmare they hadn't realised they were trapped in. The improvement wasn't subtle. On standard depression rating scales, patients showed reductions of 50% or more in their symptom scores within hours from a single dose of a drug that was supposed to be an anaesthetic. And here's what really made researchers sit up. The improvement often lasted. Not forever, but for days. Sometimes a week or more. A single ketamine infusion could provide relief that persisted long after the drug itself had left the body. Patients weren't just getting high and feeling temporarily better. Something was actually changing in their brains that outlasted the immediate effects of the drug. The psychiatric community's response was basically, "That can't be right, run it again." They ran it again, same results. They ran it at other institutions with other researchers and other patients. Same results. By 2006, a larger study at the National Institutes of Health confirmed what Crystal had observed. Ketamine worked fast. Ketamine worked on people who didn't respond to anything else. Ketamine was doing something that no other psychiatric medication could do. The question was, what the hell was it doing? And could they figure it out before the drug's reputation as a party substance and bladder destroyer made it impossible to use medically? Understanding why ketamine works for depression requires a brief detour into how your brain actually functions. Don't worry, I'll keep it simple, partly because the neuroscience is genuinely complicated, and partly because I don't want to pretend I understand it better than I do. The traditional theory of depression, the one that's dominated psychiatry for decades, goes something like this. Depression is caused by low levels of certain neurotransmitters in your brain, particularly serotonin. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers that brain cells use to communicate with each other. When you don't have enough serotonin, the theory goes, your brain can't communicate properly and you get depressed. This is why SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, became the go-to treatment for depression. They work by preventing your brain from reabsorbing serotonin after it's been released, which means more serotonin hangs around in the gaps between your neurons, which theoretically means better communication, which theoretically means less depression. The theory is elegant. The theory makes intuitive sense. The theory has one small problem. It might be wrong, or at least incomplete. See, SSRIs increase serotonin levels within hours of taking them. The chemical change happens fast. But the mood improvement, when it happens at all, takes weeks. If depression were simply a matter of low serotonin, you'd expect to feel better as soon as the serotonin levels rose. You don't. Something else is going on. Current thinking is that the serotonin story is, at best, part of a much more complicated picture. Depression probably isn't just about having too little of one chemical. It's about how your brain cells connect to each other, how they communicate, how they adapt and change over time. It's about the structure and function of neural networks, not just the chemicals floating between them. And this is where ketamine gets interesting. Ketamine doesn't touch serotonin. It doesn't care about serotonin. It works on a completely different system, the glutamate system. Glutamate is the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter, the chemical that makes neurons fire. It's involved in learning, memory, and something called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to change itself, to form new connections, to rewire, to adapt. It's how you learn new skills, form new memories, recover from injuries. A brain with healthy neuroplasticity is flexible, responsive, able to update itself based on new experiences. A depressed brain, research suggests, has reduced neuroplasticity. The connections between neurons weaken. The brain becomes less flexible, more stuck in patterns that don't serve it well. The negative thought loops that characterize depression. I'm worthless, nothing will ever get better, what's the point? Aren't just thoughts. They're ruts worn into neural pathways, grooves that the brain keeps falling into because it's lost the flexibility to climb out. What ketamine appears to do, and I say appears because this is still being studied, is rapidly increase neuroplasticity. It blocks a certain type of glutamate receptor, the NMDA receptor if you're keeping track, which triggers a cascade of effects that ultimately result in your brain releasing growth factors and forming new synaptic connections. In simple terms, ketamine doesn't just change how you feel temporarily, it might actually help your brain rewire itself. The implications of this are kind of staggering. It suggests that depression isn't just a chemical imbalance to be corrected with chemicals, it's a structural problem, a brain that has gotten stuck and needs help getting unstuck. And ketamine, for reasons we're still figuring out, seems to give the brain a kick that helps it start rebuilding. One researcher described it as rebooting the brain, which is a metaphor that's almost certainly too simple, but it captures something true. Ketamine doesn't fix depression by adding more of something you're missing. It fixes depression by helping your brain remember how to fix itself. The dissociation, that floaty, disconnected K-hole feeling that party users chased, might actually be part of how it works, or at least correlated with how it works. The research is still unclear. Here's what we know. When people receive ketamine for depression, the ones who experience more dissociation during the infusion tend to have better outcomes. The deeper you go into that weird disconnected state, the more likely you are to feel better afterward. It's as if the dissociation itself, the temporary dissolution of your normal sense of self, is somehow therapeutic. Which is wild, right? The thing that makes ketamine a party drug, the thing that makes people lie on floors at raves, unable to move, convinced they're travelling through dimensions, might be the same thing that makes it work for depression. The feature, not the bug. Some researchers think the dissociation represents a kind of psychological reset. When you're depressed, you're trapped in certain patterns of thinking about yourself and your life, the rumination, the self-criticism, the certainty that everything is terrible and will stay terrible forever. These thoughts aren't just thoughts, they're your identity. They're who you believe yourself to be. Ketamine at sufficient doses dissolves that identity temporarily. For an hour or so, you stop existing in the normal sense. The stories you tell yourself about yourself. I'm a failure. I'm unlovable. I'm broken. Stop being told because there's no one there to tell them. When you come back, when consciousness reassembles itself, there's an opportunity to reassemble it differently. To come back without the stories. To rebuild your sense of self from scratch, without the depressive patterns automatically reinstalling themselves. It's like turning a computer off and on again, except the computer is your sense of who you are, and the reboot gives you a chance to not reload all the malware that was making you miserable. Again, this is theory. This is researchers trying to explain a phenomenon they didn't expect and still don't fully understand. But it's theory that's consistent with what patients report. Many describe the experience of ketamine treatment not just as feeling better, but as seeing themselves differently. The lens through which they view their own lives shifts. Perspectives that seemed impossible. I might actually be okay, things might actually improve, I might actually deserve to be happy, suddenly become available. The dissociation opens a door. What walks through it is up to you. Here's where the cosmic irony of ketamine reaches its peak, where the story folds back on itself in a way that would be funny if it weren't so serious. The same dissociation that makes ketamine addictive, that pulls party users back again and again, chasing the escape, destroying their bladders in pursuit of that feeling of being somewhere else, is potentially the same mechanism that makes it heal depressed brains. The teenager in Hong Kong snorting K at a rave, and the suicidal patient in a Yale clinic receiving an IV infusion are, in some neurological sense, doing the same thing. They're both dissociating. They're both temporarily leaving their normal sense of self behind. They're both travelling to that other place, wherever it is, that ketamine takes you. The difference is context. The difference is intention. The difference is medical supervision and controlled dosing and therapeutic integration. But the molecule doesn't know the difference. The molecule doesn't care if you're at a party or in a hospital. The molecule just does what it does to glutamate receptors, and the human brain responds however it responds, and whether that response saves you or destroys you depends on factors that have nothing to do with chemistry. Same drug that destroyed Matthew Perry. Same drug that's giving people their lives back after decades of suffering. Same atoms, same configuration, same mechanism of action. The only difference is everything around it. The dose, the setting, the support, the reason you're taking it in the first place. It's the same knife that can perform surgery or commit murder. The knife doesn't care which one it's doing. That's not its job. By 2010, the psychiatric community had accepted that ketamine worked for depression. The evidence was too consistent, too replicated, too dramatic to ignore. The question shifted from does this work to how do we actually use this? And that's where things got complicated. Because ketamine wasn't a new drug, it was an old drug with existing patents that had long since expired. An old drug that any pharmaceutical company could manufacture. An old drug that couldn't make anyone rich. This is the dirty secret of drug development. Pharmaceutical companies don't develop drugs out of altruism. They develop drugs to make money, and you make money from drugs by patenting them, by having exclusive rights to sell them, by being the only source. Generic drugs, drugs whose patents have expired, don't make pharmaceutical companies much money. because anyone can make them and competition drives prices down. Ketamine was generic. Ketamine was cheap. Ketamine was already available at every hospital pharmacy in the world. If ketamine worked for depression, doctors could just prescribe it. No new development needed. No exclusive rights to fight over. No billion-dollar patent to protect. From a public health perspective, this was great news. A cheap, widely available drug that treats one of the most common and debilitating conditions on the planet. Fantastic, let's use it. From a pharmaceutical industry perspective, this was terrible news. There was no financial incentive to study ketamine further, to run the massive clinical trials needed for FDA approval for depression, to do the expensive work of proving what everyone already knew. Why would any company spend hundreds of millions of dollars proving that a drug works when they wouldn't be able to profit from the result? This is why, despite the mounting evidence, ketamine didn't get FDA approval for depression. The studies existed, the proof existed, the patients being helped in off-label clinical settings existed, but the formal approval process requires someone to pay for it, and nobody wanted to pay to approve a drug they couldn't profit from. So ketamine remained officially an anesthetic, used for depression only off-label, a term that means doctors were prescribing it for something other than its approved purpose. This is legal. Doctors do it all the time, but it creates a grey area, a space where insurance companies don't have to cover treatment, where patients often have to pay out of pocket, where the medical establishment's official position doesn't match what practicing psychiatrists are actually doing. The result was predictable: ketamine clinics. If you've got depression and money, ketamine treatment has become surprisingly accessible. If you've got depression and no money, good luck. Starting in the early 2010s, clinics began popping up across the United States offering ketamine infusions for depression. They operated in that grey zone of off-label prescribing, technically legal, medically justified, but not officially approved by the FDA for this purpose. You'd walk in, meet with a provider, receive an IV drip of ketamine while reclining in a comfortable chair, and walk out a few hours later hopefully feeling better than you'd felt in months. The cost? Somewhere between $400 and $800 per infusion, and you'd need multiple infusions, typically 6 over 2 to 3 weeks for the initial treatment, then maintenance sessions every few weeks or months to sustain the effect. Do the math. An initial course of treatment might cost $3,000 to $5,000. Maintenance over a year might add another $5,000 to $10,000. For many people, this was more than they could afford. For some, it was worth mortgaging their futures for. When you've been suicidal for years and someone offers you a treatment that might actually help, price becomes relative. What's money compared to wanting to stay alive? The clinics themselves range from responsible to predatory. Some were run by psychiatrists who carefully screened patients, provided integration therapy alongside the ketamine, monitored for side effects, and genuinely tried to help. These clinics operated like legitimate medical facilities because they were legitimate medical facilities, just practicing in a regulatory grey zone. Others were less careful. Pop-up operations that saw an opportunity to cash in on desperation. Minimal screening, no follow-up care, just credit card processing and ketamine administration over and over to whoever was willing to pay. The Wild West of psychiatric medicine, where the sheriffs hadn't arrived yet and the prospectors were doing whatever they wanted. And then there was telehealth. If ketamine clinics were the grey zone, telehealth ketamine was the "what are we even doing anymore" zone. Starting around 2020, accelerated by the pandemic which made remote healthcare suddenly acceptable, companies began offering ketamine prescriptions via video call. You'd have a consultation with a provider over Zoom or a similar platform, answer some questions about your mental health history, and if you qualified, They'd mail ketamine tablets directly to your home. Read that again. They would mail dissociative drugs to your house. The ketamine came in the form of lozenges or sublingual tablets, not the IV infusions used in clinical settings, but oral formulations that you take at home by yourself without medical supervision. The companies provided guidelines. Have a friend present. Set up a comfortable space. Don't operate heavy machinery afterward. Don't take more than prescribed. Whether people follow these guidelines was, of course, entirely up to them. The telehealth model was, depending on your perspective, either a revolutionary democratization of mental health treatment or an absolutely insane approach to controlled substance distribution. Probably both. On one hand, it made ketamine accessible to people who didn't live near a clinic, who couldn't afford $600 per infusion, who needed help and couldn't get it through traditional channels. A month's supply of lozenges might cost $200 or $300, still not cheap, but far more accessible than repeated clinic visits. People in rural areas, people with mobility issues, people who couldn't take time off work for clinic appointments, suddenly they had an option. On the other hand, we were mailing dissociative drugs to people's homes and trusting them to use them responsibly. The same drug that was destroying bladders in Hong Kong, the same drug that killed Matthew Perry, the same drug that makes people lie on floors unable to move, convinced they're communicating with entities from other dimensions. Here's your prescription. Use as directed. Good luck. The companies involved would argue, and did argue loudly, that they were operating responsibly. They screened patients. They required check-ins. They monitored for signs of abuse. They were providing legitimate medical treatment for a legitimate medical condition, just doing it remotely. Critics would argue, and did argue, equally loudly, that this was pharmaceutical recklessness dressed up in tech startup language, that you can't safely administer dissociative anesthetics without in-person supervision, that the screening was inadequate, the monitoring was inadequate, the whole model was designed to maximize convenience and minimize accountability. The truth, as usual, was probably somewhere in between. Some people got genuine help through telehealth, ketamine. Some people got drugs mailed to their house and used them to get high. Some people were saved. Some people were harmed. The molecule, as always, didn't care which outcome applied to which person. In 2019, the FDA finally approved a ketamine-related drug for treatment-resistant depression. Note the careful wording, ketamine-related, not ketamine itself. The drug was called esketamine, brand name Spravato. It was a nasal spray. It was produced by Johnson & Johnson's pharmaceutical division Janssen, and it was, chemically speaking, half of ketamine. Ketamine, like many molecules, exists in two mirror image forms called enantiomers. They're like your left and right hands, same components, different arrangements. Regular ketamine is a mixture of both forms. Esketamine is just one of them, the S form, isolated and purified. Did isolating one enantiomer make the drug more effective? The research was mixed. Some studies suggested esketamine worked about as well as regular ketamine. Some suggested it might not work quite as well. The evidence was unclear, which is a polite way of saying scientists were arguing about it. What isolating one enantiomer definitely did was allow Johnson & Johnson to patent it. You can't patent regular ketamine. It's been around since 1962. The patents are long gone. But esketamine, that's a new drug. That's patentable. That's worth hundreds of millions of dollars in development costs because the return on investment is potentially billions of dollars in sales. Cynics would say Johnson & Johnson didn't develop esketamine because it was better than ketamine. They developed it because they could own it. The FDA approved Spravato with significant restrictions. It could only be administered in certified healthcare settings. Patients had to be monitored for at least 2 hours after taking it. They couldn't drive for the rest of the day. The drug couldn't be taken home. Every dose has to be supervised. These restrictions were, depending on your perspective, either appropriate caution given the drug's dissociative effects or a way to make the treatment expensive enough to be profitable. If you have to go to a clinic every time, if you have to be monitored for hours, if you can't just pick up a prescription at the pharmacy, then the healthcare system can charge for all that supervision. The drug becomes a service, not just a pill. Spravato launched with a price tag of around $600 to $900 per dose. Patients might need it twice weekly at first, then weekly, then less frequently for maintenance. Insurance coverage was inconsistent. Many people who might benefit couldn't afford it. And here's the awkward part. Generic ketamine, the stuff that works just as well, if not better, costs around $10 per dose. The pharmaceutical industry had taken a cheap, effective drug and created an expensive, complicated version that they could control. They'd solved the problem of ketamine being too cheap to profit from by making something slightly different and charging 60 times as much for it. Public health triumph, profitable innovation, regulatory capture by pharmaceutical interests, all three at once. Welcome to American healthcare, where the answers are always yes and also somehow no. Despite all the complications, the costs, the access issues, the regulatory grey zones, the telehealth controversies, ketamine has helped an enormous number of people. The testimonials are almost hard to believe, which is exactly why they're important to mention. People who had been suicidal for years, who had tried every medication, who had given up hope entirely, describing their first ketamine treatment as a turning point. Not in vague, gradual terms, but in specific, immediate ones. I woke up the next day and wanted to be alive. I felt like myself for the first time in 20 years. The voice in my head that had been telling me to die finally shut up. These are people for whom nothing else worked. People who had been through the entire psychiatric pharmacopoeia without relief. People who, statistically speaking, were likely to attempt suicide because treatment-resistant depression has a terrifyingly high mortality rate. For them, ketamine wasn't just an improvement, it was a rescue. The speed matters. When you're suicidal, when every day is a struggle to keep yourself alive, being told that you need to wait 6 weeks to see if a medication might help isn't just frustrating, it's potentially fatal. People die during those 6 weeks. People die waiting for treatments to work, for psychiatrists to return calls, for therapy appointments to open up. The delay built into traditional depression treatment isn't just an inconvenience. For some people, it's a death sentence. Ketamine works in hours. That's not a small thing. That's potentially the difference between someone making it through a crisis and someone not making it through. That's the difference between calling a hotline and not needing to call a hotline. That's lives saved not through some long-term statistical improvement, but through immediate, tangible, right-now intervention. The critics have legitimate points. The long-term effects of repeated ketamine use aren't fully understood. The potential for bladder damage from chronic use is real. The Hong Kong experience proved that. The addiction potential exists. The risk of people using medical ketamine access to feed a recreational habit is non-zero. These are real concerns that deserve real attention, but so is the reality that depression kills people. A lot of people. More than 700,000 people worldwide die by suicide every year. Depression is one of the leading causes of disability globally. The existing treatments don't work for everyone. They don't work for a significant percentage of people who try them. When weighed against that toll, a treatment that works fast and works for people who don't respond to anything else isn't just useful, it's necessary. The risk-benefit calculation isn't simple. Nothing about ketamine is simple. But for many patients and many psychiatrists, the calculation comes out in favour of use, with caution, with monitoring, with awareness of the risks. but use nonetheless. Because when the alternative is suffering without end, or death, the risks of treatment start looking different. So here's where we are now, in the third decade of ketamine's career as an antidepressant. The drug works. That's no longer in question. Decades of research, thousands of patients, countless lives saved or improved. Ketamine is a legitimate psychiatric treatment, whatever the regulatory status says. But it's also still ketamine. Still the party drug. Still the bladder destroyer. Still the substance that killed Matthew Perry. Still something you can buy illegally, use recreationally, abuse to the point of destroying your organs. The global situation is a beautiful mess of contradictions. In China, they cracked down on ketamine manufacturing so hard that the entire industry packed its bags and moved to India. It's like trying to stop rain by yelling at one specific cloud. The cloud just floats somewhere else and keeps raining. India is now the world's ketamine pharmacy, supplying both the hospitals that need it and the dealers who want it, because shipping containers don't have opinions about their contents. In the UK, they made ketamine Class B, same category as speed, thinking scary prison sentences would make people choose beer instead. Ketamine use went yeeper after reclassification. The drug looked at the new law, shrugged, and continued being popular. British teenagers kept snorting. British urologists kept reconstructing bladders, and British politicians kept looking confused about why their get tough approach produced zero results. It's almost like making things illegal doesn't make people stop wanting them. Someone should look into that. Write a study. Maybe several hundred studies, since we've been ignoring this pattern for about a century. In America, they created a system so convoluted it could only have been designed by a committee that hated clarity. Ketamine is Schedule 3, which means doctors can prescribe it, but you can't have it without permission. Except doctors can also prescribe the fancy patented version Spravato, which costs $900 instead of $10, works about the same, but has FDA approval because a pharmaceutical company paid for the studies. So you can get the cheap version or the expensive version, except insurance only covers the expensive version, except insurance usually fights you on covering the expensive version too. If you designed a system specifically to maximize confusion and minimize access, you couldn't do much better. Honestly, impressive work. Meanwhile, ketamine keeps finding new ways to be useful, because this drug apparently has more career changes than a millennial with commitment issues. Researchers are now studying it for OCD, for PTSD, for chronic pain conditions that don't respond to anything else, for eating disorders, for alcohol addiction, in a plot twist that feels like the universe trolling us, using one drug to treat addiction to another drug. The dissociative that people get addicted to might help people stop being addicted to other things. Make it make sense. You can't. Nobody can. There's research into ketamine for grief therapy, for end-of-life anxiety in terminal patients, for the kind of existential depression that comes from staring into the void and having the void stare back. Apparently, briefly leaving your body helps you make peace with eventually leaving your body permanently. Therapists are combining ketamine with psychotherapy in what they call ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, or CAP, which sounds like something you'd order at a coffee shop, but is actually a structured approach where you take ketamine, have a therapeutic experience, and then process it with a trained professional. The idea is that the dissociation opens a window, briefly loosens the grip of your usual thought patterns, and a skilled therapist can help you climb through that window to somewhere better. Does it work? The studies are promising. The anecdotes are dramatic. People describe breakthroughs in single sessions that years of regular therapy didn't achieve. Whether this is genuine therapeutic revolution or really good placebo effect is still being sorted out. Probably some of both. That's usually the answer with brain stuff. The veterinary world has its own ketamine stories, and they're exactly as weird as you'd expect when drugs and animals mix. Zoo veterinarians use ketamine to sedate everything from lions to elephants, to that one aggressive ostrich that nobody can get near otherwise. There's something darkly funny about the same drug that sends ravers to alternate dimensions also being the thing that lets a veterinarian safely approach a hippopotamus. The hippo doesn't know it's temporarily visiting another plane of existence. The hippo just wakes up confused about why its teeth got checked. Ketamine is on the WHO's essential medicines list partly because of veterinary use. In developing countries, it's often the only way to safely treat large animals. You can't exactly explain to a cow that the surgery is for its own good and please hold still. You need the cow to temporarily leave the building consciousness-wise, and ketamine is the eviction notice. Some veterinary clinics have become targets for theft because they stock ketamine. People break in, ignore the computers and cash registers, and head straight for the drug cabinet. It's a specialised form of burglary. You need to know what you're looking for and where it's kept. The black market for veterinary ketamine is its own weird ecosystem, connecting animal hospitals to party scenes through supply chains that would make a logistics professor weep. The future is probably more chaos, because that's what the present is and nobody's figured out how to change it. Pharmaceutical companies are racing to develop ketamine but better. Drugs that target the same brain pathways without the dissociation, the addiction risk or the bladder damage. They want the antidepressant effect without the part where patients feel like they're temporarily deceased. Whether they'll succeed is unclear. What is clear is that any successful drug will cost a fortune, because that's how pharmaceutical development works. Solve the science problem, create an access problem, call it progress. The telehealth ketamine industry is in a weird middle state. Not dead, but not thriving. Not illegal, but not fully legitimate. Operating in regulatory grey zones while everyone waits to see what the rules will eventually be. Some companies have tightened their protocols. Some have quietly shut down. Some keep operating like nothing happened, betting that the scrutiny will pass. The patients keep coming because the need is real, even if the system serving that need is janky. Ketamine clinics keep opening because there's money in depression and desperation. Some are excellent, staffed by genuine experts who care about outcomes and contribute to research and treat patients like humans. Some are mills that process as many infusions as possible, collect payment and move on. From the outside, they look identical. Nice recliners, calm music, professional-looking websites. The difference only becomes clear once you're already a customer, which is not ideal for a medical service. Here's what's genuinely weird when you step back and look at the whole picture. Ketamine was invented in 1962 to solve a specific problem, knocking people out for surgery without the nasty side effects of existing options. That problem got solved. Mission accomplished. Story should have ended there. But drugs don't stay in their lanes. Drugs escape. Drugs get discovered by curious humans who want to see what happens if they take them differently, in different doses for different reasons. Drugs develop fan bases and critics and black markets and legitimate markets. Drugs become culture. Calvin Stevens made ketamine because surgery patients kept having hellish experiences on PCP. He couldn't have predicted that his solution would end up being used to help soldiers in Vietnam, sedate horses, fuel rave culture, destroy teenage bladders in Hong Kong, cure treatment-resistant depression, kill Matthew Perry and generate thousands of research papers about consciousness and glutamate and neuroplasticity. He just made a powder. We made it into everything else. The powder itself hasn't changed since 1962. Same atoms, same structure, same mechanism. What's changed is everything around it. What we know, what we want, what we fear, what we regulate, what we allow. 60 years of humans projecting our hopes and anxieties onto a chemical compound that just sits there doing what chemistry does. 60 years of arguing about whether it's medicine or poison, tool or threat, breakthrough or danger. 60 years of the same powder producing wildly different outcomes depending entirely on who's using it and how. The arguments will continue, the research will continue, the parties will continue, the destroyed bladders will continue, the saved lives will continue, all of it, simultaneously, because ketamine doesn't pick a lane and neither do humans. One last thing before we go. If you're struggling with depression that won't lift, ketamine might be worth exploring. It's not magic, but it's real, and it's helped people who'd tried everything else. Talk to a psychiatrist. Look into your options. The party drug reputation shouldn't stop you from accessing a legitimate treatment, and if you're using recreationally, just know what you're playing with. The floaty feeling is real. The cosmic experiences are real. The bladder damage is also real. Safer than heroin is a low bar that still leaves plenty of room for ruining your organs. I'm not your parent. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your own body. But maybe keep track of how often occasionally is happening. Maybe notice if the fun is turning into need. Maybe get help before the damage becomes permanent. The drug doesn't care either way. Taking care of yourself is your job. 63 years of ketamine. Surgical tool, battlefield medicine, party drug, bladder destroyer, depression cure. The most confused career arc in pharmaceutical history. We started with a chemist trying to make surgery less traumatic. We ended up with all of this. The raves and the clinics and the telehealth prescriptions and the reconstructed bladders and the saved lives and the lost lives and the ongoing argument about what this powder means and what we should do about it. Same ketamine the whole time. Different humans making different choices about how to use it. That's usually how it goes with tools. We invent them for one purpose. They escape. They become something else. We spend decades figuring out the consequences. We're still figuring this one out. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and maybe think twice before accepting mystery powders in club bathrooms. Or don't. Your brain, your bladder, your call.